And yet those structures were the invisible foundations that made everything else possible. They were quiet, often overlooked, but without them nothing could truly exist or function. June leaned forward slightly in his chair, his posture calm but attentive, as though he was gently guiding the conversation toward a deeper place. "You're now part of that same pattern," he said in a steady voice. Vivian didn't respond immediately. The silence lingered between them, not uncomfortable but reflective, like the pause that follows an important realization. June noticed the lack of response, but he didn't push the point. Instead, his eyes drifted down toward the table where the folder still rested. It looked ordinary, almost unimpressive at first glance, yet inside it were diagrams, notes, and carefully constructed ideas that represented 16 long years of dedication, patience, and quiet obsession. 16 years of watching, questioning, mapping, and refining. June spoke again, his tone thoughtful, almost philosophical. "You know something interesting about maps?" Deviant lifted his gaze slightly. "What?" June allowed himself a faint smile before answering. "They are never complete." Deviant gave a small nod. "Yes," he agreed. Maps were never perfect reflections of reality, they were only the best understanding available at a particular moment in time. June tapped the folder lightly with his finger. "And the moment the landscape changes," he said slowly. Deviant finished the thought almost automatically. "The map must change too." June smiled again, a quiet acknowledgement that they were following the same line of reasoning. Another pause settled over the room, the kind that felt full rather than empty. Eventually June leaned back in his chair again, folding his hands loosely. "You said curiosity motivated you," he continued. Deviant nodded once more. "Yes." "And now," June added, studying him carefully, "you're curious about systems understanding each other." Deviant answered simply, "Yes." June held his gaze for a moment before speaking again. "That curiosity could keep you busy for another 16 years. Deviant didn't hesitate. "Yes." June raised an eyebrow slightly. "Does that thought concern you?" Deviant shook his head faintly. "No, why not?" June asked. Deviant's answer came with a calm certainty that felt almost disarming. "Because time passes anyway." For a moment June said nothing, then a quiet laugh escaped him. "That's a very simple truth," he admitted. Deviant nodded again. "Yes, but people often forget it." Their conversation slowed again after that, drifting into a quieter rhythm where thoughts carried more weight than words. June eventually turned his attention toward the skyline beyond the window. The mist rising from the river had grown thicker, softening the lights of the city into blurred reflections that stretched across the water like smudged streaks of gold and silver. He watched the shifting haze for a moment before speaking again. "You know when explorers chart new terrain?" Deviant listened carefully. "They often believe they are searching for something very specific." June gestured gently toward the distant horizon outside the glass. "A route. A resource. A destination." Deviant nodded. "Yes." June's voice softened slightly as he continued. "But sometimes the most important discovery isn't what they expected to find." Deviant considered that for a moment before replying quietly, "Yes, sometimes the real discovery is realizing how much larger the landscape is than they imagined." June's eyes returned to him, thoughtful and observant. "You've spent 16 years exploring a particular landscape," he said slowly, the words hanging in the air like the beginning of another realization waiting to unfold. "You're starting to glimpse how far it might extend." Deviant didn't deny it, though he offered no immediate reply. The admission lingered quietly between them, as if both men understood the weight behind those words. The room slipped into silence again, the kind that invites reflection rather than discomfort. After several seconds, June leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. His tone remained calm, but curiosity sharpened his voice. "If your next question is about systems learning to understand each other," he began, pausing briefly as if choosing his words with care. What do you think will happen when those systems eventually begin asking questions of their own? Deviant remained silent for a few seconds after June finished speaking. The question settled into the room with a different gravity than the ones before it. Up until now, their conversation had focused on structures, networks, and the subtle way systems shape human decisions behind the scenes. But June's latest question reached further ahead, beyond current technology, into possibilities that felt both fascinating and unsettling. Outside the wide glass wall of the office, the city continued its slow, steady rhythm far below them. A faint siren echoed somewhere in the distance before fading back into the quiet altitude of the tower. The mist above the river had thickened slightly, softening the edges of the skyline and turning the scattered lights into blurred streaks of color. Finally, Deviant spoke. If systems begin asking questions, he said calmly, then they've reached a level of awareness about their environment. June watched him closely, narrowing his eyes slightly in thought. That sounds like a careful answer, he said. Deviant nodded once. It is. June gestured lightly. Explain. Deviant folded his hands loosely on the table as he gathered his thoughts. Most systems today respond to inputs. June nodded in agreement. Yes. They process information and produce outcomes, Deviant continued. Yes, June replied again, following the logic. But questions require something different. June rested his chin against his hand, intrigued. What exactly? Deviant answered simply. Curiosity. June's eyebrows lifted slightly. Curiosity in systems, he repeated slowly. That's a provocative idea. Deviant remained calm. It's also a natural progression. June leaned back in his chair a little. Why natural? Deviant explained, because systems that observe patterns long enough eventually encounter gaps in those patterns. June nodded slowly as understanding formed. Anomalies. Yes, Deviant said. And anomalies invite investigation. June tapped the table lightly with one finger. So you're suggesting that advanced systems won't just process data? Deviant shook his head slightly. No. They'll start exploring it. June's gaze drifted toward the skyline again, thoughtful. That would change the relationship between humans and the systems they built. Deviant nodded. Yes. June looked back at him. How? Deviant answered in the same calm tone. Instead of giving instructions, people would start having conversations. June allowed a faint smile to appear. Conversations with systems, he repeated. Deviant nodded. Yes. June chuckled softly. That's a strange image. Deviant replied, it's already beginning in simple ways. June considered that and nodded thoughtfully. That's true. Another quiet pause settled between them. After a moment, June spoke again. You know, the history of technology is full of moments where people underestimated the implications of what they built. Deviant listened attentively. Early engineers believed computers would simply automate calculations, June continued. Yes, Deviant said. But eventually those machines began organizing entire economies. Deviant nodded again. June leaned forward slightly. You're suggesting a similar transition? Yes, Deviant replied. From systems that respond, to systems that participate. June's expression sharpened with interest. That's a significant shift. Deviant agreed. Yes, but it also raises a question. He paused, letting the thought settle. June looked at him. Which question? Deviant spoke quietly. Who guides that participation? For a moment he considered the answer before continuing. Initially, humans. June nodded slowly. And later? Deviant answered carefully, later, the relationship becomes more collaborative. June leaned back again, reflecting on the word. Collaborative, he repeated. That word carries a lot of implications. Deviant agreed. Yes. June studied him closely. You're describing systems that don't just serve people. Deviant shook his head slightly. No. They interact with them. The room grew quiet once more. Outside the tower windows, a slow-moving barge drifted along the river, its dim lights barely visible through the thickening mist. June eventually spoke again. You've clearly spent time thinking about the long-term consequences of what you're building. Deviant answered simply, yes. June smiled faintly. More than most founders. Deviant didn't disagree. June continued, his tone relaxed. That's probably why this conversation feels less like a business meeting and more like a philosophical one. Deviant remained silent, which June took as confirmation. But philosophy aside, June added after a moment, there's something practical I'm curious about. Deviant looked at him attentively. June tapped the folder lightly again. You said earlier that your system observes movement and adapts to patterns. Yes. June paused briefly before finishing his thought. If systems eventually begin asking questions, what kind of questions do you think they'll ask first? Deviant glanced toward the skyline again before answering. They'll probably start with inefficiencies. June nodded immediately. That makes sense. Deviant continued, they'll notice places where resources move slowly. Yes, June agreed. Or where information gets distorted. Yes. June leaned forward again. So the first questions will still be technical. Deviant nodded. Yes, but eventually those questions will expand. June tilted his head slightly. In what direction? Deviant answered with quiet certainty. Toward purpose. June's eyebrows rose again. Purpose. Deviant nodded once more. June studied him carefully. That's a complicated subject. Deviant agreed. Yes. June exhaled softly. Even for humans. Another thoughtful silence filled the room before June folded his arms loosely and added, you know, when people start discussing purpose and systems, the conversation often becomes emotional. Deviant nodded. Yes. June finished the thought quietly. Some people worry about losing control. Yes, Deviant replied calmly. Others imagine extraordinary possibilities. June allowed a faint smile to appear on his face, the kind that suggested he had heard both reactions many times before. Both responses are understandable, he said quietly. Yes, Deviant agreed, but they also miss something important. June paused for a moment, waiting for him to continue. Deviant explained in the same measured tone, systems don't suddenly become mysterious entities. June tapped the table gently with his fingertips, acknowledging the point. They still reflect the intentions of the people who built them. Deviant nodded slightly in agreement. Yes. June's gaze remained steady and thoughtful. So the real question isn't whether systems will eventually ask questions, he said slowly. Deviant finished the thought. No. The real question is what kind of people are designing them. Another quiet pause settled in the room as the idea lingered between them. June glanced once more toward the skyline beyond the glass wall. The distant lights shimmered faintly through the mist rising from the river. You've spent 16 years thinking about systems and human behavior, June said eventually. Yes. June turned back toward him. What's the most important lesson you've learned about people? Deviant took a brief moment before answering. People are more adaptable than they believe. June smiled softly at that. That's encouraging. Deviant nodded slightly. Yes, but adaptation often happens slowly. June leaned back in his chair again, reflecting on the idea. Until something changes the environment enough that adjustment becomes unavoidable. Deviant agreed. Yes. June's voice grew thoughtful. Your system might eventually create that kind of shift. Deviant remained calm. Yes, but gradually. Another silence followed, the office lights reflecting softly on the glass wall and creating faint layers over the distant city beyond. June eventually spoke again. You know what I find most interesting about curiosity? Deviant looked at him. What? June gestured lightly toward the skyline. It spreads. When one person begins asking better questions, others start asking their own. Deviant nodded slowly. Yes. That's how intellectual movements begin. June smiled faintly again. You're building a system designed to observe patterns. Deviant responded thoughtfully. Yes, but it might also inspire people to think differently about those patterns. June studied him carefully. That possibility doesn't seem to bother you. Deviant shook his head slightly. No, June tilted his head. Why? Deviant answered calmly. Because understanding rarely causes harm. June raised one eyebrow slightly. Really? Deviant nodded. Yes. When it does, it's usually because someone misunderstands what they've discovered. June laughed quietly. That's been happening throughout human history. Deviant agreed with a small nod. Another thoughtful pause settled between them. June rested his chin against his hand again. You know, the explorers we talked about earlier, he said slowly. Deviant listened carefully. They weren't just looking for new routes. June glanced again toward the skyline. They were looking for answers. Deviant nodded. Yes. June continued, but every answer created new questions. Deviant replied simply, yes. June's gaze returned to him. You've spent 16 years answering one question about how systems connect. Deviant nodded again. Yes. June leaned forward slightly. And now that answer is opening another question. Yes. June continued, about how systems understand each other. The room grew quiet again as the thought settled between them. After a few moments, June spoke once more. You know what that reminds me of? Deviant looked at him. What? June answered thoughtfully, the way science progresses. Deviant listened attentively. A discovery doesn't end curiosity, June said, tapping the table lightly. It expands it. Deviant nodded. Yes. June smiled faintly. You've built something that might generate entirely new questions. Deviant replied calmly, yes, and that's one of the most powerful things a system can do. Another silence followed. Outside the windows, the mist over the river continued drifting slowly, reshaping the reflections of light across the water. June eventually leaned back in his chair again. You know, he said thoughtfully, for most of this conversation we've been talking about bridges. Deviant nodded. Yes. June continued, but now it feels like we're discussing something slightly different. Deviant waited. June clarified, not just bridges between networks, but bridges between ways of thinking. The room settled again into quiet reflection. June watched the distant skyline for several seconds before turning back to Deviant. Then he asked another question, his tone calm but curious. If systems eventually begin asking questions about the world they operate in, he said, pausing slightly, what do you think they'll be most curious about first? Deviant did not answer immediately. The question settled into the quiet of the office the same way the mist had settled over the river outside, gradually, without urgency, yet with a quiet presence that subtly changed the atmosphere of the room. June watched him patiently, accustomed to waiting for thoughtful answers. Deviant's gaze drifted toward the skyline again. The city at night no longer looked like a simple collection of buildings, instead it resembled a vast field of signals, lights blinking from communication towers, windows glowing in steady patterns, and long ribbons of headlights tracing the movement of traffic along distant roads. After a moment, he finally spoke. They'll be curious about inconsistencies. June tilted his head slightly. Inconsistencies. Deviant nodded. Yes. June asked, why that first? Deviant explained calmly, because systems learn patterns before they learn meaning. June nodded slowly. That makes sense. Deviant continued, if a system observes enough activity, it begins recognizing regularity. June responded thoughtfully. Traffic patterns. Deviant nodded. Yes. June added, supply chains. Yes. Information flow. Yes. June leaned forward slightly again, now fully engaged in the idea. Deviant finished his thought with quiet clarity. Once a system understands the rhythm of those patterns, the next thing it notices is when something breaks them, when traffic slows without explanation, when resources move in unexpected ways, when information arrives distorted or delayed. Those small disruptions become signals worth investigating. And in that moment, the system stops merely observing the world and begins trying to understand it. And when something breaks those patterns, the system notices, Deviant said quietly. June smiled faintly at that statement, recognizing the logic immediately. Just like experienced analyst, he replied. Deviant nodded once. Yes. Analysts spend most of their time studying anomalies. A brief silence followed, the kind that suggested both men were tracing the same line of reasoning from different perspectives. June rested his chin against his hand thoughtfully. So the first curiosity of an advanced system would be something like, he paused for a moment, choosing his words carefully. Why does this pattern suddenly change? Deviant answered simply, yes. June continued the chain of thought. And that question leads to investigation. Yes. June tapped the table lightly with one finger. Which eventually leads to understanding. Deviant nodded again. Yes. June leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful smile appearing on his face. That's a very familiar intellectual path. Deviant agreed quietly. Yes. June continued, it's how scientists work, observe patterns, notice anomalies, ask questions. Deviant responded again with the same calm certainty. Yes. June smiled softly. You're describing the architecture of curiosity itself. Deviant didn't react to the observation, but the idea remained suspended in the quiet air between them. Another moment passed before June's gaze shifted once again toward the skyline beyond the glass wall. The city lights shimmered faintly through the mist. You know, he said thoughtfully, when humans first began studying complex systems, whether ecosystems, economies, or societies, they discovered something interesting. Deviant listened attentively. The systems themselves were often more stable than people expected. Deviant nodded slightly. Yes. June continued, but that stability depended on delicate balances. Deviant agreed. Yes. June added, and small changes could ripple outward in surprising ways. Deviant responded again, yes. June turned back toward him. Your system is observing many of those balances. Deviant answered calmly, yes. June paused briefly before continuing. And if it starts asking questions about anomalies, he let the sentence hang for a moment before finishing it. It might notice things people overlook. Deviant nodded. Yes. June's expression sharpened slightly with interest. That could be very powerful. Deviant replied carefully, yes, but also sensitive. June folded his arms loosely as he considered that point. You've built something that may eventually detect changes before most organizations even recognize them. Deviant acknowledged it with a quiet nod. Yes. June studied him carefully. That creates responsibility. Deviant answered calmly, responsibility comes with building infrastructure. June smiled faintly. That's true. Another silence filled the room. Outside the window, the mist over the river had thickened so much that the water itself was now almost invisible. Only scattered reflections of distant lights hinted at its presence. After a moment, June spoke again. There's another dimension to curiosity. Deviant looked at him. What? June explained, perspective. He gestured lightly toward the skyline. Humans tend to ask questions from their own vantage point. A city planner asks different questions than a merchant. Deviant nodded. Yes. June continued, a scientist asks different questions than a politician. Deviant agreed again. Yes. June leaned forward slightly. But systems that observe multiple networks simultaneously, he paused for emphasis. They might develop a very unusual perspective. Deviant nodded slowly. Yes. Wider than most individuals. June's voice grew thoughtful again. That could lead to questions people wouldn't normally consider. Deviant answered simply, yes. Another quiet pause followed. June rested his chin against his hand again. You know, he said slowly, the first time you came to my office 16 years ago, you asked a question about systems connecting. Deviant listened. June continued, and now you're describing systems that may begin asking their own questions. Deviant nodded. Yes. June smiled faintly. That's quite a progression. Deviant acknowledged it with another calm yes. June glanced briefly at the folder on the table again, though he still didn't open it. I imagine your engineers have discussed these ideas with you. Deviant confirmed, yes. June asked, and they are comfortable with the direction the system is evolving? Yes. June nodded slowly. That's important. Deviant agreed. Yes. June continued thoughtfully, because systems like this don't grow through the work of one person. Deviant finished the idea. No. They grow through collaboration. June leaned back again. That brings us back to something you mentioned earlier. Deviant looked at him. What? June answered with a faint smile. Trust. Deviant nodded slightly. Yes. June studied him carefully. You trust your team? Yes. And they trust you? Yes. June smiled faintly again. That's probably why the system has developed with such discipline. Deviant remained silent. June continued thoughtfully. You know what often happens when systems become complex? Deviant asked calmly, what? June answered, people start improvising. Deviant nodded once. Yes. Improvisation can be useful. June added, yes, but it can also introduce instability. Deviant agreed again. Yes. June's gaze grew thoughtful. You seem to have avoided that problem. Deviant replied simply, yes. June asked, why? Deviant answered, because the map came first. June smiled slightly. The map again. Deviant nodded. Yes. Another quiet stretch followed as June glanced toward the skyline once more. The city seemed calmer now, as if the deeper hours of night had begun settling over it. After a moment he spoke again. You know something interesting about explorers? Deviant looked at him. What? June explained, they often don't realize the full significance of their journeys while they're happening. Deviant listened attentively. June gestured lightly. They are focused on immediate problems, navigation, supplies, weather. Deviant nodded. Yes. June continued, but decades later, historians look back and recognize turning points. Deviant agreed again. Yes. June turned his attention fully back to him. You might be standing at one of those turning points. Deviant didn't respond. June noticed the silence. You don't seem very interested in that possibility. Deviant answered calmly, speculation doesn't change the work. June laughed softly at the practicality of the response. That's a very practical answer. Deviant nodded. Yes. Another pause settled between them before June leaned forward slightly again. You know what historians often notice about turning points? Deviant asked. What? June replied quietly, they rarely look dramatic at the time. Deviant listened quietly as June continued speaking in the same calm, reflective tone that had guided their conversation through the long evening. Their quiet conversations, June said, glancing slowly around the office as if the room itself represented years of similar discussions. Small decisions. Deviant nodded slightly. Yes. June continued thoughtfully, moments where someone chooses to continue exploring an idea instead of abandoning it. Deviant agreed again. Yes. June smiled faintly as he reflected on the past. 16 years ago, you chose to keep exploring. Deviant answered simply, yes. June gestured lightly toward the folder still resting on the table. And now that exploration is producing something substantial. Another silence followed, but it wasn't uncomfortable. The room felt calm and reflective, almost suspended outside the usual urgency of corporate negotiations and deadlines. It felt more like a place where ideas were being examined slowly and carefully rather than rushed toward conclusions. After a moment, June spoke again. You said earlier that curiosity motivated you. Deviant nodded. Yes. June tilted his head slightly, studying him. Has that changed at all over the years? Deviant shook his head. No, June continued, still curiosity. Deviant replied calmly, yes. June raised an eyebrow with a faint smile. Not ambition. No, not competition. No, June leaned back slightly, amused by the consistency of the answers. That's probably why your responses feel so consistent, he said. Deviant waited patiently. June added thoughtfully, curiosity doesn't require an audience. Deviant nodded. No. It just requires a question worth exploring. June glanced once more toward the skyline beyond the glass wall where the mist had begun to soften the outlines of the city lights. You've built a system that might eventually ask questions of its own, he said slowly. Deviant responded, yes. June continued, that suggests something interesting. Deviant remained silent, allowing him to finish. The system may eventually become curious about things you never anticipated. Deviant acknowledged the idea without hesitation. Yes. June studied him carefully before asking, how do you feel about that possibility? Deviant answered calmly, almost as if the answer had always been obvious to him. That's the nature of exploration. June nodded slowly, appreciating the simplicity of the response. Yes, he said. You build a vessel. Deviant nodded again. Yes. June continued the thought. And eventually it travels farther than the builder imagined. Deviant answered quietly, yes. June leaned back once more, folding his arms loosely as the quiet returned to the room. After several seconds he spoke again, his voice thoughtful. You know what might be the most fascinating moment in the evolution of your system? Deviant looked at him. What? June replied, the first time it asks a question that no one in your organization had considered before. Deviant took a moment to reflect on that idea before nodding slightly. Yes. June's expression softened. That's when you know the system has truly begun exploring. Another silence followed. Outside the office window, the skyline appeared almost dreamlike through the mist, the buildings fading into silhouettes layered with scattered light. June eventually leaned forward again, his curiosity clearly not exhausted. If that moment comes, he said slowly, pausing briefly for emphasis, and your system discovers something unexpected about how the world's networks behave, his eyes rested steadily on Deviant as he asked the next question. What do you think people would do with that knowledge? Deviant considered the question without rushing. The office felt quieter now, as though the building itself had settled into the deeper hours of the night. Most of the surrounding towers had darkened, leaving only a few scattered offices still illuminated, small glowing rectangles suspended in the dark grid of the city. Deviant looked toward them for a moment before answering. People will do what they've always done with new knowledge. June watched him attentively. Deviant continued, they'll interpret it through their own priorities. June nodded slightly. That's true. Deviant went on calmly, some will see opportunity. June agreed. Yes. Some will see risk. Yes. And some will refuse to believe it. June smiled faintly. That pattern is very consistent. Deviant nodded. Yes. Another quiet pause settled between them before June rested his chin against his hand again. You're describing 3 common reactions, he said thoughtfully. Exploration. Deviant nodded. Yes. Protection. Yes. And denial. Yes. June leaned back slightly. Those reactions appear in almost every major shift in history. Deviant listened as June continued. When railroads expanded, when electricity spread, when the internet appeared. Deviant nodded after each example. Yes. June glanced toward the skyline again. And each time, society eventually adjusted. Deviant added calmly, yes, but the adjustment rarely happens quickly. June nodded slowly. No, Deviant continued, it usually unfolds over years. June agreed. Yes. Deviant finished the thought. Sometimes decades. Another moment passed before June tapped the table lightly again. So if your system discovers something unexpected about global networks, he said thoughtfully, some people will want to use that insight immediately. Deviant nodded. Yes. June continued, others will want to regulate it. Yes. And others will insist it's exaggerated. Yes. June smiled softly. That sounds like the beginning of a very familiar conversation. Deviant didn't disagree. Another quiet stretch followed as the mist outside the window drifted higher, softening the tops of several nearby buildings. Eventually June spoke again. You know something interesting about knowledge. Deviant looked at him. What? June explained, it rarely spreads evenly. Deviant listened carefully as June continued. Some groups adopt new ideas quickly. Deviant nodded. Yes. Others take much longer. Yes. June folded his arms loosely as he reflected on the pattern. That uneven adoption often shapes the direction of progress. Deviant agreed. Yes. June smiled faintly. Early adopters experiment. Deviant nodded again. Yes. June continued, later adopters stabilize the system. Deviant answered calmly, yes. June studied him thoughtfully. You're probably expecting something like that. Deviant replied simply, yes. June gestured lightly toward the folder again. Your system may first attract curious organizations. Deviant nodded. Yes. June finished the thought slowly. Then cautious institutions. Yes, Deviant replied calmly, continuing the steady rhythm of the discussion. And eventually governments. June tilted his head slightly at that point, his expression thoughtful. That stage will be particularly complicated, he said. Deviant nodded once in agreement. Yes. June continued, reflecting carefully on the implications. Governments tend to view infrastructure through the lens of stability. Deviant responded with the same quiet certainty. Yes. June added another dimension to the thought. And sovereignty. Deviant nodded again. Yes. June looked thoughtfully toward the skyline beyond the glass wall, where the distant city lights shimmered faintly through the lingering mist. A system that observes patterns across borders could raise interesting questions, he said slowly. Deviant agreed. Yes. June continued, but it could also provide valuable insight. Deviant acknowledged that as well. Yes. A brief pause followed before June leaned forward slightly. You've built something that may eventually help people see connections they couldn't previously detect. Deviant nodded. Yes. June continued listing the possibilities in a thoughtful tone. That could influence policy decisions. Deviant answered, yes. Economic planning. Yes. June paused briefly before adding, and possibly even diplomacy. Deviant responded calmly once more. Yes. June's expression became more contemplative as he considered the scope of those outcomes. That's a wide range of influence. Deviant replied carefully, yes, but influence doesn't necessarily mean control. June nodded immediately. Exactly. He tapped the table lightly as he elaborated. Information shapes decisions, but people still make those decisions. Deviant agreed. Yes. June continued, and they bring their own motivations. Deviant nodded again. Yes. June smiled faintly. Which means the same knowledge can lead to very different outcomes. Deviant acknowledged that truth with a quiet yes. Another silence settled between them. Outside the window, a few distant aircraft lights drifted slowly across the sky like small moving points against the darkness. June watched them for a moment before speaking again. You know, there's something else about discovery. Deviant looked at him. What? June explained thoughtfully, it often reveals problems that were previously invisible. Deviant listened attentively as June continued. When scientists first began studying climate systems, they uncovered complex feedback loops. Deviant nodded. Yes. June added another example. When economists began modeling global markets, they discovered vulnerabilities. Deviant acknowledged the point again. Yes. June leaned back slightly in his chair. Your system might reveal similar complexities in network behavior. Deviant agreed. Yes. Patterns that weren't obvious before. June's gaze returned to him. That could make some people uncomfortable. Deviant answered calmly. Yes, because it challenges assumptions. June smiled slightly at that observation. Humans are very attached to their assumptions. Deviant responded quietly, yes, but progress usually requires revising them. Another thoughtful pause filled the room before June rested his chin against his hand again. You seem very calm about the possibility of revealing unexpected truths, he said. Deviant nodded. Yes. June asked, why? Deviant answered simply, because systems behave the way they behave. June raised an eyebrow slightly. That's a very direct answer. Deviant replied, yes. Reality doesn't change just because people prefer a different explanation. June laughed softly at the practicality of the statement. That's a perspective many analysts would appreciate. Deviant remained silent. June continued, shifting the discussion slightly. You know, there's a subtle difference between discovering information and understanding it. Deviant asked, what? June explained, discovery happens quickly. Deviant nodded. Yes. June continued, understanding takes time. Deviant agreed again. Yes. June leaned forward slightly as he expanded the idea. If your system reveals something important about how networks behave, he said slowly, pausing for emphasis, the discovery might happen in minutes. Deviant nodded. Yes. June finished the thought. But society could take years to absorb the implications. Deviant agreed calmly. Yes. June smiled faintly. That delay is part of human nature. Deviant nodded once more. Yes. Another silence settled between them as the lights of the city seemed calmer now, as if the entire landscape had entered a slower rhythm in the late hours of the night. After a moment, June spoke again. You mentioned earlier that bridges change choices. Deviant nodded. Yes. June continued, and now you're describing knowledge that could change decisions. Deviant responded simply, yes. June tilted his head slightly, reflecting on the comparison. In some ways, that's another kind of bridge. Deviant considered the thought before replying. Yes, a bridge between information and action. June nodded. Exactly. He added thoughtfully, and just like physical bridges, those connections can be used in many ways. Deviant acknowledged the point. Yes. June continued listing possibilities. For cooperation. Deviant nodded. Yes. For competition. Yes. For protection. Yes. June smiled faintly again. You're building infrastructure that could support all of those outcomes. Deviant responded calmly. Yes. Another quiet moment passed before June glanced once more at the folder resting on the table, though he still made no move to open it. Finally, he spoke again with quiet fascination in his voice. You know what fascinates me about this entire conversation? Deviant looked at him. What? June answered slowly. We've spent hours discussing systems, networks, curiosity, and discovery, and yet the most interesting part may not be the technology itself, but the way it changes how people think about the world around them. Yes, Deviant replied calmly, but we haven't talked much about the future of your company. June allowed a small, knowing smile to form as he leaned back slightly in his chair. That's unusual in a business meeting, he observed. Deviant simply nodded. Yes. June continued, his tone thoughtful but relaxed. Most founders focus on valuation, growth projections, and market share. Deviant acknowledged the point again with a quiet yes. June gestured lightly with one hand as if outlining the contrast between typical conversations and the one unfolding tonight. But you've been describing something more fundamental. Deviant nodded once more. Yes. June leaned back further, reflecting on the direction the discussion had taken. You've been describing the behavior of complex systems, he said. Deviant agreed. Yes. June added, and how people interact with them. Deviant answered again with the same calm certainty. Yes. June's voice took on a more reflective tone. That suggests you're thinking beyond the next quarter. Deviant nodded. Yes. June continued quietly, or even the next decade. Deviant agreed once more. Yes. June studied him silently for a moment before speaking again. You're thinking in terms of landscapes again. Deviant nodded. Yes. Another pause settled over the room as both men glanced toward the wide glass windows overlooking the city. Far beyond the skyline, the faintest hint of a lighter horizon had begun forming, so subtle that it might have been missed by anyone not paying attention, yet clearly signaling that the night was slowly giving way to morning. June noticed it and smiled slightly. It looks like we've talked long enough to watch the night change, he said. Deviant glanced briefly toward the horizon. Yes. June rested his hands flat on the table again. You know what often happens just before dawn, he asked. Deviant looked at him. What? June explained thoughtfully, people start asking new questions. Deviant waited as he continued. The quiet hours of the night allow ideas to settle, June said, gesturing lightly toward the skyline. And when morning approaches, perspectives shift. Deviant nodded. Yes. June's gaze returned to him. You've spent 16 years exploring a system. Deviant acknowledged it again. Yes. June continued, and tonight you've described how the system might begin exploring the world in return. Deviant answered calmly. Yes. Another silence followed, deeper now as the subtle light along the horizon continued to grow. Then June spoke again, his tone calm but thoughtful. If that exploration continues, he said slowly, pausing for emphasis, and your system eventually uncovers patterns about human behavior that even people themselves haven't fully understood, his eyes remained steady on Deviant as he asked the next question. What do you think humanity will learn about itself? Deviant did not answer immediately. The horizon beyond the skyline had softened slightly with the earliest suggestion of morning light. It was not yet dawn, but the darkness no longer felt permanent. The city seemed to sense the coming shift in rhythm as the night slowly thinned. Deviant watched the skyline for a moment before finally speaking. Humanity will probably learn something it already knows. June's eyebrows lifted slightly. Already knows. Deviant nodded. Yes. June leaned forward a little, intrigued. That sounds paradoxical. Deviant replied calmly, it often is. June gestured lightly. Explain. Deviant rested his hands gently on the table as he spoke. Most complex discoveries reveal patterns that were always present. June nodded slowly. Yes. Scientists say something similar. Deviant continued, they don't invent the laws of nature. June finished the thought with a faint smile. No, they recognize them. Deviant nodded again. Yes. June folded his arms loosely as he reflected on the idea. So you think insight about human behavior will feel familiar? Deviant answered calmly. Yes, even if it's new. June's expression grew thoughtful. That suggests the system wouldn't be teaching humanity something entirely foreign. Deviant shook his head slightly. No. It would be revealing structure. June nodded. Yes. Another quiet pause settled between them as the city light outside began fading slowly against the brightening sky. June tapped the table gently with one finger. You know, he said thoughtfully, psychologists have spent decades studying human behavior. Deviant nodded. Yes. June continued, sociologists have done the same. Yes. Economists as well. Yes. June leaned back slightly again. And yet people still struggle to predict how societies will behave. Deviant answered simply, yes. June smiled faintly. That's part of what makes human systems fascinating. Deviant nodded. Yes. They are structured but unpredictable. June studied him carefully. You think your system might eliminate some of that structure? Deviant replied calmly, yes, but it won't eliminate unpredictability. June raised an eyebrow slightly. No. Deviant explained, because humans constantly reinterpret their environment. June nodded slowly. That's true. We adapt. Deviant continued, yes. An adaptation changes the pattern. June glanced again toward the skyline where the mist above the river was beginning to dissolve as the air shifted with the approaching morning. You're describing something similar to weather, he said thoughtfully. Deviant waited as he continued. Patterns exist, June said slowly, but precise outcomes remain difficult to predict. Deviant nodded. Yes. June smiled softly. That's an interesting analogy. Another pause followed before June leaned forward once more. You know what might be the most surprising discovery? He asked. Deviant looked at him. What? June answered thoughtfully, that human behavior is often more cooperative than people assume. Deviant considered the idea before nodding slightly. Yes. June raised an eyebrow in mild surprise. You agree? Deviant nodded again. Yes. June leaned forward a little more, curiosity returning to his voice. Why?